Okay, thank you very much to Judy for inviting me. So, yes, I'm here today on behalf of Ravensbourne University, London. We are actually a university that works in design and creative technologies, and increasingly we're also involving virtual reality and augmented reality in our research. Several projects that we're doing currently which work with that. The CAS 50, that's the Computer Art Society, and as the title indicates, we're actually 50 years old. We've been working with digital artists for the past half century, and that's actually going to be the core of some of my examples today, are some of the things that we've actually been recovering from those times, and that sort of problem of, that's even in the medium term of about half a century, how quickly these formats change and how much one has to actually do to resurrect them. And last but certainly not least, the Lumens Prize for Art and Technology, and the founder Carl Rappaport is here today, and Jack Addis, senior curator as well, and that's also sort of works with Lumen projects. And the prize, which is currently open, and I shall certainly encourage you to look at the website and look at the categories, because it includes categories for virtual reality, augmented reality, artificial intelligence. Previous winners have included VR art pieces as well, so please have a look at those and see what has come up recently. And as the prize develops and the sort of number of entrants increases, I think it shows really it's a good cross-section of what is currently going on in terms of artists engaging with current technologies and really what's being developed, and on a very international basis as well. I've called this Rescuing Digital Relics simply because in the several projects I've been involved with prior to my current position, it's been very much about recovering that sort of past history and actually finding out what travels and what doesn't through time, and really seeing the things that have been sort of made sort of sensible in the future, because the people of that time back in the 1960s and 70s, when they were sort of doing some of the first pieces of computer-based art, actually had the foresight to print them on physical media. And the fact that they were physically sort of reified meant that in fact the physical format survived much better than the digital ones, although we do indeed have some early digital archives as well, which I will touch on. But the Computer Art Context Histories CASH project, which Professor Charlie Gear, now at University of Lancaster, ran at Birkbeck, along with the computer artist Paul Brown, recovered the archives of the Computer Art Society. And those had survived pretty much by chance, just like many of these archives did, because they survived outside the artistic mainstream. They had not, at that stage, been really much collected by museums. There were a few good exceptions, of course. The ZKM in Karlsruhe is a particular sort of centre for the study of earlier forms of media art. But certainly in the UK, until the Victoria and Albert Museum showed great interest through their senior curator, Doug Dodds, and actually then acquired the archives of the Computer Art Society to become the National Archive for Computer Art, which happened at the end of the CASH project. And then the second project, CAT, Computer Art and Technocultures, that built on that. We were fortunate to receive a large bequest of computer arts related material from the United States, from Patrick Prince, a digital art historian who'd worked with SIGGRAPH. The SIGGRAPH digital conference, one of the biggest probably the biggest of its kind in computer graphics, also has run an art show for many years, since the early 1980s in fact, and Patrick had acquired the archives because she had actually run the show herself for some time. So we were lucky in fact to inherit that. That also passed then to the V&A as well, and then that formed the basis for an exhibition in 2010 and subsequent exhibitions since, which have actually drawn on those works too. And so there's ongoing digitization and study of those archives. And then I've also then, following that, worked to develop courses around digital culture and projects in relation to the heritage of this area as well. Now, one of the stalwarts of this area is Professor Frieder Narker. He was actually present, in fact, organised one of the very first exhibitions, perhaps in fact the first exhibition of computer art in 1965 at the University of Stuttgart. And the works that he refers to here, when he says that early computer art was revolutionary, but at the same time traditional, it was traditional insofar as it resulted in paperwork to be put up on the walls of the gallery. Well, that was actually hitting the sort of technological constraints at the time. It was very difficult to to do the sort of projections that we're doing now from the computers in 1965, where you had to wait up to a week for the outputs to come through. So in fact, the outputs on paper or later on film, as we'll see, were actually in many cases the only way to actually display what was going on with the computer. And Narker and his compatriots in Stuttgart were students of a professor called Max Benzer, who believed that it was possible to represent art as information, which for the late 1950s and early 60s was a very radical idea indeed. And he later got into a great argument with Joseph Beuys about that very sort of concept. But Narker, who's still alive today and still working, also points to the revolutionary aspect of the computer art, because in fact it went away from being so much an art of the object and looked at art as a process, and in fact as something that could be encoded. And this is something, of course, that Sol was referring to earlier, and that others have said, that you're actually transferring digital files. It is possible to have a sort of a direct and perfect digital copy, but as you will see, it's actually the ways in which those things are transferred and the ways in which they're then displayed and reified is the key problem for us. And so in fact, although Narker holds up the sort of traditional format of early computer art as a problem, actually it also has been a blessing, because it's enabled so much of the early work to still be recovered. But it's, as he says, computer art is radically rational. I quite like that concept. Now, somebody who's done a lot of work in the preservation of this area is John Ippolito, who's currently at the University of Maine. The Variable Media Network was a group set up by the Langlois Foundation in the early years of the 21st century. And Ippolito's current site, called Forging the Future, includes several tools which developed from ones that the Variable Media Network put together. And this variable media questionnaire I find particularly valuable. It's a way of actually interrogating archives and documentary resources and existing pieces of interactive and digital work to find a way to actually preserve them. And some of the concepts behind it have gone out in more recent years into other institutions. I'm pretty sure it's influenced institutional thinking, but it's still worth going back to the source and finding out what they were looking at. And the variable media categories are quite useful to this day. They look at art, for instance, that's interactive, encoded, networked, interchangeable in the sense that you could rebuild it again using different components but to the same plan, reproduced, of course, art that's actually on various formats that can actually be re-recorded, performative art, obviously, and art that they say is contained, i.e. sort of has a particular sort of container within which it comes. And it's slightly blocky because I had to grab this from the original variable media site, which is encoded in Flash and therefore quite difficult to run on modern computers because the site itself dates back to the about 2004. But the tools and strategies, so although Ippolito sells a particular sort of tool to do this, you can capture some parts of it from the video descriptions on his site. And I think it's particularly interesting to see the sort of process of questioning both artists and documentary sort of preservers and those who also were involved in the making of the work, because it's actually, as he says, it's as much about capturing the process around it as about capturing the work itself and understanding how it's put together. And in many ways, that's been my approach over the last few years when I've been sort of working with these archives, and I think it also informs what others have been doing as well. So you actually look at not only the work to be preserved, but the things around it, the things that sort of enable it to be put back together and understood. And in several cases, as you'll see, there have been major works of media art over the last 50 years that have been almost completely lost, and yet have actually re-emerged in new ways. And the four strategies that they say here about storage, migration, emulation, and reinterpretation are all key to that sort of work as well, and we'll see examples of those too. Storage obviously means preserving the works as best as possible in their different forms. Migration means moving them along from old, in this case, old digital formats into new ones, and it can more easily be done with some works than others. Emulation, of course, is taking old computers and rerunning them on new ones, because of course it's now possible for modern day machines to actually emulate many different types of older computers, even those with specialized hardware. That can all be done in software now, and that's one strategy that's actually proved quite successful. But reinterpretation, which of course is the most controversial, is also quite often the most interesting and effective, especially if the work has particular physical components that can't actually be easily emulated or migrated in other ways. So we'll see some examples of that. And just to touch on a couple of influential shows, the ZKM, as I said, have been involved in the recovery and storage and analysis of a lot of early media work. And one of the key examples of this is the exhibition they did in 2008 called Bit International, looking at a show that was running in Zagreb, in former Yugoslavia, in modern-day Croatia, and that was an ongoing series that was running throughout the 1960s about kinetic art and technology, but in '68 they did one particularly on the digital, and basically the ZKM put the entire show back on in a format that replicated how the original looked, but also in the process both conserved and updated some of the works as well. So you had to go there physically to see it, because many of these digital works were of course presented physically, but in its form and format it resembled what was there. Something a little different. I don't know how many of you know that Andy Warhol, towards the end of his life, did some digital art. And being Warhol, he actually did that as part of a promotion for Commodore computers when they launched the Amiga in 1985. He took the singer Debbie Harry and digitized her through an early video camera, and then sort of worked over the top of her image to produce in a way, a typical sort of Warhol print, but digitally. And you will still find the video for that kicking around YouTube, and it's still quite interesting to see Warhol's take on that, and his interview in Amiga World, which I remember reading back in '86 when I was somewhat younger than I am now, actually fired my interest in going and researching computer art. Funny enough, so that was the stepping off point for me back in the mid-'80s too. Little did I realise I would sort of come across this much later again. But Warhol's work, of course, kind of disappeared. That part of his output, because he died not long afterwards, and therefore the work itself, being very small and very sort of, in comparison to the other things he was doing, survived only at the Warhol Foundation in the form of the computer itself, the Amiga 1000, and the discs that he had. And it was only in 2014 when Corey Archangel, an artist who's famous for actually using sort of retro elements of games, he's most famous for hacking NES cartridges and using the elements therein to create art of his own, happened to hear about it at a conference and contacted the Warhol Foundation, and through them found the surviving archive and the computer. And the trouble was, of course, given the sort of lapse of time between then and now, was how to actually not only read the software, but represent it on a modern-day computer. So working with Carnegie Mellon, Golan Levin, another media artist, put him in touch with the computer group there. They actually created an interface to allow them not only to run the software and read the disks, but also to cope with the fact the Amiga used a very different graphics format to modern-day computers, transferring and then updating Warhol's work and recovering it for the modern day. In a way then, having the media obviously was the key to that, but also then being able to recover it was part of the problem. But now we have a look at the first computer art exhibition, which is computer-generated pictures. Howard Wise, if you haven't come across him, was a key figure in the area of video art and TV art. He was obviously a sponsor of Namjoon Paik and the Vasulkas and many others, but also was sufficiently far-sighted to have the first exhibition of computer art in the United States. And you can see there that work, that slightly jagged work, because I had to copy it from a low-res file on the internet, is actually Michael Knowles' piece, which is one of the first examples of computer art. But you can see there the invitation to that comes on another early form of digital media, which is, of course, the punch card. And if you go back far enough, digital media did not come in magnetic discs. It certainly didn't come in flash drives. It actually came on paper, and it came in the form of paper cards that had to be kept in a certain order to be able to run the program that would produce the image. And the little quote there actually comes from the New York Times, which interestingly recognizes, it says, no matter what the future holds, and scientists predict a time when almost any kind of painting can be computer generated, the actual touch of the artist will no longer play any part in the making of a work of art. Invitation to Cybernetic Serendipity, a key British, a watershed British show at the ICA, run by Yasha Reichart in 1968. I won't dwell on that because the work I'm going to mention as a sort of example of resurrection is this. Gordon Pask was a major figure in cybernetics, the study of systems and interaction. And long before anything was really talked about in terms of artificial intelligence, the sort of key interest for many scientists and indeed others was how cybernetics could capture the sort of motion within systems, the sort of feedback that could take place. And Pask, although not an artist per se, was very interested in performance and conversation. And the work that he made to go into cybernetic serendipity serendipity. You can actually see typical bits of early computer art on the walls as paper. His thing was actually this fiberglass sculpture that was interactive. There were different components in there that he designated as male and female, and they could communicate with each other by means of light beams that would sort of set them off if they were if they recognized there was a sort of male or female within the space. Audience members could get into that conversation by taking a mirror and guiding the light to small light sensitive sensors that would actually enable the sculptures to then see their opposite numbers, as it were. So the conversation could be entered into by the audience, and they could guide that and interact with it. So hence it was part of a conversation of a type, and was a most interesting piece. But then, like many of Pask's other things, it disappeared sort of after the exhibition. It was recreated then at the College of Creative Studies in Detroit. Paul Pangaro was a student of Pask, and what they've actually done is not only resurrect its means of working, but actually updated it to make the conversation rather different. The sort of balance of males and females has been sort of rethought in much more sort of equal terms for now, but also using 3D printing, using models of the original, using reference points, and reprogramming the entire thing. They have, of course, recreated it, reinterpreted it, and reimagined it. So in fact, this fulfills quite a few of the points that John Ippolito was making in his variable media network. Something that I've been involved with, which I'm quite proud to have had a part in fact, is the resurrection of the Sennster. I don't know how many people here have heard of the Sennster. Good, I see a few hands. Very briefly, just to say, a Polish emigre artist called Edward Ignatowicz, who came to the UK during the Second World War. In the 1960s, he had a background in sculpture and photography, but in the 1960s he got very interested in hydraulic robots and the way that you could actually represent life by means of a system that would give a sense of an object being alive, perhaps, through its movement. And it would also have a certain amount of intelligence. I mean, the system driving this, which was quite a large computer for its day, had all of 16K of memory, and into that 16K, Ignatowicz wrote a very sort of simple responsive program. The Sennster was based on response to sound. In its head, you can see the head unit there, there was this very small, there was a set of directional microphones, and basically its behavior was that if it heard sounds that were fairly quiet, it would move forward to investigate them, because the neck itself is prehensile, the base is fixed, and if it heard loud sounds, it would rear away from them. And on those two simple bases was actually the basis for all of its interactivity and response. And it was commissioned by Philips. It was put in a place called the Evoluon, which was a sort of big dome, rather like the Epcot Centre, but Philips's version in Eindhoven. And it attracted crowds for about 4 or 5 years until Philips decided it was taking up too much attention away from Philips products in the Evoluon and decommissioned it. They didn't tell the artist. It was the most costly piece of media art of its day. In 1970, it cost about the same as I think a semi-detached house in London, in fact, to build that, and it was built at UCL. Amazingly, it survived the years because it was bought by a Dutch engineering firm after Philips discarded it and welded into place as outside, in the outdoors, outside the gates of the factory, and stayed there for the best part of 30 years, up until about the mid-2000s. Alexander Zivanovic, a researcher at Imperial, who's now based at Middlesex, as a boy was very intrigued by a mention of the Sennster in a book, and then later on tried to track down all of the surrounding material. Ignatowicz himself had died in 1988, but his widow had kept all of the works in her house, and all of the other materials, I should say, relating to the Sennster, though of course not the machine itself. And to cut a very long story short, Alex recovered a lot of that, and as part of our cash project, we also then helped pull together those elements. But the final thing, although Alex tried and failed to get the Science Museum to acquire the sculpture from the Dutch engineering firm, whose owner really didn't want to part with it, after he passed away, the AGH University in Krakow, with Anna Olszewska, who's actually a media art historian, as part of their centenary celebrations, were able to acquire that sculpture. And what they did, they used their knowledge of hydraulics and robotics to rebuild all the original working parts. They estimate about 80% of it still lives, still original, and the rest they then reinterpreted and made work last year in October 2018. And the Sennster, which was very much a mythical work and something of a relic in itself, is now actually back in working order and will be, I hope, travelling to the UK at some point as well. So that's a really very sort of useful story in itself. Just see if how am I doing for time? Okay, fine. I'll wrap it up shortly. This is a project I'm currently working on with Kate Sullivan, Tony Pritchard, who did the first one of the first computer animations in the UK called the Flexipede. I'll say it was the first one which wasn't actually a scientific simulation in 1967. Tony Pritchard also animated the Channel 4 logo. It was Lambert design, but he actually did the animation for that in the early 1980s. He sadly passed away last year, and Kate and myself, Kate had been interviewing and working with Tony up until his death. We had to move very quickly to help empty his flat in East Finchley, because otherwise, you know, the relatives were going to sell it and get rid of everything. Tony, who was a hoarder, he'd been there since 1972, had actually built some of his media archive into the walls and the ceilings and everything else. We had to try and sort of bring it all down. Much of it in the form of film cams, which of course still can be read on the diminishing number of Steenbecks that are out there, but we still have to now find the places that we can actually both shoot and digitize from these films. Other things, of course, like those punch cards, which are the original program for the Flexipede, have to be kept in exactly the right order, because otherwise the program wouldn't work. But we've also recovered that, and you can see there it came from London University Computing Services. And that strange-looking thing, which you must be puzzling over there, is actually part of the original networking cable for the Atlas computer that, for some reason, Tony had in a suitcase. I've got no idea why he preserved that, but again, a lot of these things are quite chancy that they still survive. We were extremely lucky to have this. The archive's now in the South End, but we're very much interested in the preservation of that. But what Kate is doing a reinterpretation based on her interviews with Tony, and also her skills as a filmmaker to recover all of that digital work as well. I will pass on now. The very final thing I was going to say, my involvement with VR and reimagining is actually something that we've just done at Birkbeck University. It was a show called Impossible Machines, Leonardo and Perpetual Motion. What we had was several surviving designs, but no other, and a short bit of writing from Leonardo. This is, of course, the 500th anniversary of his death. We were tasked by the Museo Galileo in Florence and researchers at Birkbeck, this is my team at Ravensbourne, with interpreting the designs that Leonardo had left and looking at how they might be realized as both a 3D animation, as augmented reality, and also as 3D models. And in fact, we spent the best part of a year redeveloping and doing that in conjunction with the scholars who were advising us. You can see in that picture, I think it encompasses the four outputs that we had really. We have a 2D animation on the projection on the wall. We have a traditional panel showing the exact sort of location and the development of Leonardo's understanding of perpetual motion, which he later realized was impossible in any case. And then standing there, you have a chap wearing the HoloLens. So we use the HoloLens as a form of augmented reality. That target on the left there is actually the target on which the HoloLens then projects a three-dimensional animation of Leonardo's work that you can walk around. And we then use those models. You can see there me actually excavating away the wax. The 3D models come in. I actually then sort of scoop that off to reveal the forms underneath, which we then exhibited to. On my own little contribution, very quickly, I built in Unity a 3D gallery of paperworks by Leonardo that we couldn't show in our physical gallery, but we could extend that then using the games engine Unity in a recreation of a space that Leonardo once worked in. So it is possible, I think, to use the VR not only to extend and understand, not only to recapture media art, but obviously to increase our understanding of more traditional art forms as well. Thank you very much.